Hello and welcome to this PIR live event webinar brought to you by Partners in Research Canada. My name is Ben Hobbs and I will be your host today. If you're joining us live, remember that you can ask questions using the chat near the bottom center of your screen and typing the questions into the pop-up window. Make sure you change the to field to include attendees, and I will relay these questions to our guests during the Q&A portion of the webinar. Today's guest is Dr. Jeremy Kerr. Dr. Kerr is a professor in the Department of Biology at the University of Ottawa, where he studies biodiversity and ecosystem degradation. Jeremy is also the recipient of the 2018 Partners in Research Science Ambassador Award. Thank you for joining us, Dr. Kerr. I'll let you take it from here.
Thank you. It's really nice to be able to join you this morning. I'm super excited to be able to talk to you a little bit about some of the kinds of things that make us very passionate as scientists. And before I start talking about one of my favorite subjects, one of the things that I would really like to tell you is that it is an incredibly interesting, fun thing to do to become a scientist. And there are so many ways to do that. Science is a huge field, and it's a field filled with wonder. And if you want to become a scientist, all you really have to do is be curious about how the world works. And there are a lot of things that you can be curious about. And today I'm going to talk to you about something that I was curious about. And I hope that by the time we're done, you'll have some questions for me. And maybe if I'm lucky, I will be able to convince you that there are some really cool things that we share our country with. And you're going to get to see a few of those things. So now I'm going to try to start my presentation, and I'll be very delighted if, as we go through, if you have some questions for me, hold on to them, and I will be happy to try to answer them a little later. Okay. This is where I get to show you that scientists often can't make things work. I'll have a go at it. Okay, does that look all right?
That looks perfect, Dr. Kerr.
Terrific. So I would like today to talk to you about monarch butterflies. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to tell you that monarch butterflies can be absolutely fascinating, but that, like so many really important things in our world, great things have small beginnings. And just hold on to that thought as we go through. But what I would like to do is begin with a quick reminder, because we walk through fields, we walk to school, we play with our friends outside, and when we do this, so often we are surrounded by other species. There are many, many kinds of plants and animals that we share our country with. And in fact, scientists have spent a bit of time trying to count all of the different kinds of things that also live in Canada in addition to just people. And if you add all of those things up, and you look at the grasses, and you look at the trees, and you count the number of kinds of mushrooms, there's something like 80,000 different kinds of animal and plant and mushroom and insect and bird out there that we share our country with. But a lot of the things that we share our country with are actually insects. And in Canada, there's something like 55,000 different kinds of insect. And a lot of those insects are very familiar to us. Here's an example of one of those kinds of insects that's really important for us because it's a bee. This is specifically a kind of bumblebee species. And what these do is they help pollinate our plants. They help plants produce fruit that we put on our tables. things like blueberries or tomatoes. If you've ever eaten a tomato or had tomato sauce, thank a bumblebee for that, because a bumblebee made it possible. So I'd just like to tell you that these insects do things that so often really help people. And of course, we think of some kinds of insects as a little icky or a little worrying or kind of scary. And, you know, everybody's probably heard of mosquitoes and probably even been bitten by mosquitoes, and nobody likes mosquitoes. But there's a lot of other kinds of insects out there, and most of them are harmless, and a lot of them are really helpful. And here's another example of one of those helpful insects. This is a kind of butterfly. It's not a monarch, but it's a kind of butterfly species, and like other butterflies and bees, these animals help. They visit flowers, and they help plants produce seeds so that we will have more plants in the future, that we will have fruits and vegetables that we can put on our tables. And in fact, there are more than 300 different kinds of butterflies in Canada. That's kind of incredible. And just by walking down the street, you can probably find a few of those kinds of butterflies during the spring and in the summer. But I'm going to talk about a very special kind of butterfly today. And you already know what it is. I hope everybody's ready, because I'm going to start off by showing you a picture of this very special kind of butterfly. And here it is. That's a monarch butterfly. No, really, it's a monarch butterfly. This is actually how monarch butterflies begin their lives. They start their lives as an egg, just like a bird does, right? A bird starts out in an egg, and then it hatches out of the egg, and it looks totally different, but it begins life as an egg. And that's what monarch butterflies do as well, along with virtually all of the other insects that are out there. They start off as an egg that's been laid on a plant. And then when this egg hatches, you don't get a chicken or something like that, which of course you get as a baby monarch butterfly. What does a baby monarch butterfly look like? Well, a baby monarch butterfly is a caterpillar. We also call this a larva. And these are bright, stripy animals that eat a kind of plant called milkweeds. And milkweeds contain some chemicals, some substances, some white, sticky goo that tastes horrible. And one of the ways that monarch butterflies try to convince birds not to eat them is they have bright colors all over their body. And those bright colors warn birds that monarch caterpillars taste terrible. But when that monarch caterpillar has eaten enough milkweed plants and it's gotten really big and fat, it goes on to its next stage of life. The next stage of life is called a pupa or a chrysalis, and we also call this a cocoon. And this is when you are looking at a butterfly which is changing from a caterpillar into its adult form. This is the bridge between being a baby caterpillar, being a baby monarch butterfly, and an adult butterfly. And they're quite carefully concealed at this point. And if you put them on a plant, which is where you'd normally find them, the chrysalis or the cocoon would be a green color, as you can see, and it would blend in with leaves all around it, and it would be quite hard to see. And then when the time is ripe and the butterfly is ready, it pops out of the cocoon, and what you see is an adult monarch butterfly. This is an incredible animal. They're quite big butterflies. You can see them in places all the way from Edmonton out to the east coast of Canada, thousands of kilometers away. And these animals fly around in our landscapes. They visit flowers. They sip nectar from the flowers, as you can see in this picture. This butterfly has landed on a flower, and it's sticking out its really long tongue into the flower, and it is sipping a tiny little bit of liquid inside the flower that contains a bit of sugar. That liquid is called nectar. It's a bit like having a sip of orange juice in the mornings. And what that does is it gives the butterfly energy so it can fly around, and it can store up those energy reserves so that it can do something truly incredible, something that almost no other butterfly species is able to do. And what that butterfly does is it travels from one part of the world all the way over to another part of the world every single year. And in fact, in the springtime, monarch butterflies fly from Mexico all the way up to Canada, thousands of kilometers away. And then in the fall or the late summer, just when we're thinking about getting ready to go back to school after a summer, those monarch butterflies get ready to fly all the way back to Mexico. But the monarchs that flew to Canada in the spring don't fly back to Mexico. The great-grandchildren of those butterflies fly back to Mexico. So there's a big growth of those populations over the summer in Canada and the United States before they make that return journey all the way back to Mexico. And when they get to Mexico, they go to a single place up in the mountains, and you get huge numbers of these butterflies all in the same place. The highest density of butterflies in the world. And that's one of the things that makes monarch butterflies so extraordinary, so incredibly special and different from so many other kinds of animal. But we have a few problems with monarch butterflies. There are fewer of them now than there used to be. And why is that true? Because this is a very beautiful animal, and we want to know why things happen. That's one of the things that makes us scientists. And I want to say that anybody can be a scientist. All you have to do is be curious. Ask questions like, why does that happen? And when you think about why, then you can do some scientific work. And what you begin to see is that sometimes the answers to these why questions are not really that complicated. And it basically just comes down to something quite simple in the case of monarch butterflies. We all need a place to live, and monarch butterflies do too. So monarch butterflies need a place to live. They're just like people in that way. And we have to protect the places that they live. The places that other animals live, we call those places habitats. And so when we talk about protecting monarch butterflies, what we talk about is also protecting their habitats, the places they live. And where do we do that? Where do monarch butterflies live? Well, they live in Mexico for part of the year, up in the mountains in these little forests. Got to make sure to protect those forests where monarchs go in the winter. But in Canada, those monarchs are also coming back here, and we've got to protect the habitats, the homes that monarchs need here in Canada. So that's part of what we have to do as well to protect monarch butterflies. And I want to just make this very simple point. Monarchs are having some trouble right now, but if we are careful and if we care, then we can make a difference and we can save monarch butterflies, as well as other kinds of butterflies and bees and other kinds of animals and plants. And what we have to do is make sure that those plants and animals have a home, just like people. But the kinds of homes that these animals want are outdoor homes, particularly particular kinds of plants. And monarch butterflies like milkweeds. And there's a bunch of different kinds of milkweeds that grow all over different parts of Canada. Here are a few of them right now. This little pink one down here, and I'm hoping people can see this. This is a common milkweed. They grow wild. Up here is a butterfly weed that is a very popular plant with all kinds of butterflies. Down here is what's called a swamp milkweed that grows in wetter places. Each one of these plants is native to Canada, is good for all kinds of species, and is especially good for monarch butterflies. Habitat that's good for monarch butterflies is good for many other kinds of animals. And if we have healthy environments that are good for other kinds of animals, that's good for people too. And here are some of the kinds of animals that we care about. Here's a bumblebee species that's so important for pollinating our crops, for making sure that we have tomatoes and blueberries. Here's one kind of butterfly species called a swallowtail butterfly. And you'll find these out in Western Canada. In Edmonton, you can see butterflies like this, and in British Columbia. Here's a little butterfly that's very small and a little bit orange, called a European skipper. They're all over the place. You can find them from Edmonton all the way out to Prince Edward Island. Here's a fritillary butterfly species. And another kind of swallowtail called a black swallowtail that loves to eat parsley and dill. And a question mark butterfly, because if you look on the outside of its wings, which you can't see in this picture here, there's a little tiny question mark on it. And that's why we call it a question mark butterfly. And of course, other kinds of bees. There's something like 800 kinds of bee species in Canada. It's a very diverse group. So we need to make sure that plants and animals have a home too. But I said earlier that anyone can be a scientist. And it's true, you just have to be curious about how the world works. You can be curious about butterflies if you want to, and monarch butterflies in particular. And if you want to learn more about butterflies, here is a website where you can get all kinds of information on where we are seeing butterflies, how many butterflies are out there, particularly monarch butterflies. And I said that you can be a scientist too. And I really mean it. And if you see a butterfly, you can tell other scientists, other students, other kids, your parents, you can tell everybody about what you saw by going to this website and recording that information. And the information, what you saw, that's scientific data. So as I said, anyone can be a scientist, and this is one of the ways that you can be a scientist too. And I want to thank you for your curiosity, for the excitement that you bring to new ideas, and for listening to me this morning as I talked about one of the things that I am very excited about myself: diversity of life around us and especially butterflies, and especially monarch butterflies. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Kerr. That was an excellent presentation. Joining us for the question and answer portion of our webinar is Stacy Joyce. She is from Partners in Research. Jeremy, if I could get you to stop sharing your screen for a moment. Thank you. Welcome, Stacy.
Thank you so much. I have been very busy while Dr. Kerr was showing us his presentation, as there are so many questions already. So I'm going to dive right in. We have our first question from the grade 3s and 4s at Montague Public School in Smiths Falls, Ontario. Wondering how long does it take the monarch butterflies to travel all the way to Mexico?
I've been to Smiths Falls. I like that place. It's wonderful that you've asked me this question, and let me tell you, so it takes them several weeks. They fly maybe 20 or 30 kilometers a day, but they've got thousands of kilometers to travel if they're going from a place like Smiths Falls all the way down to Mexico. So it might take them 3 weeks or even 4 weeks to get from a place like Smiths Falls back down to Mexico in time to avoid the bad weather.
Right. And I'm going to fly right to another class here. We're going to go to Madame Ash's grade 5s at Eden Rose Public School in Mississauga, wondering how butterfly migration routes are affected and why. Maybe there are lots of factors that you could comment on.
And this is where we get to talk about some of the science. That is a terrific question. So let me tell you some of the issues that are a challenge for butterflies like monarchs that migrate over large distances. They've got to pass through environments that people have changed in very important ways. And here are two of the ways that we change those environments that can be very difficult for butterflies to deal with. One of them is that sometimes we use too many pesticides, and this can cause wildflowers to begin to disappear. So pesticides go after weeds and pest insects, and they go after fungus that can infect crops. Pesticides also can affect things that butterflies need. So if you apply too many pesticides, or pesticides that are not necessary, then what can happen is you can kill all the milkweed. And the consequence is that the butterflies are coming through these environments, but the resources those butterflies need have been removed from the landscape. And that means it's very hard for the butterfly to refuel on its trip south. Just like in an airplane, if you take an airplane and you fly from one place to another and you go a large enough distance, the airplane has to land and get more fuel. Well, butterflies are a bit like that. They travel a large distance, they've got to land on some flowers, sip some of that nectar and refuel. But if we remove those nectar sources, the butterflies have a hard time refueling. So pesticides are one way that can happen, and here's a second way. We sometimes remove habitats. So habitat loss is a problem, and if instead of a field filled with flowers, we have a field filled with just dirt, or just buildings with no flowers, then again, that's very hard on butterflies and other kinds of animals that need to refuel in those places.
I imagine that flying from Canada to Mexico might make an organism pretty hungry. And our next question on that trip to Mexico, it comes from Ms. Falconer's class at Dr. Roberta Bondar School in Calgary, Alberta, wondering how do the butterflies know how to get to Mexico? You explained that it wasn't even, the butterflies that had gone last year. It's not their children going, it's their grandchildren going. How on earth do they know where to go?
That is actually one of the big mysteries in butterfly biology, and we think we're getting closer to understanding this. There's a few parts to that story, but let me tell you two parts that we currently think are true. But I want to say that you've asked an extremely perceptive, important question, and you're touching on the edge of what we think we understand as scientists. And that's one of the things that is really cool about scientists, because sometimes you get to discover something nobody ever knew before. But the closer you are to the edge of what we don't know, sometimes the more uncertain our knowledge is. So here are two of the things that butterflies use to help them navigate their way to the same place every year in Mexico. One of them is the sun. These butterflies actually are kind of programmed to move in a way which is relative to the direction of the sun. So the sun is coming in at a certain angle at a certain time of year. And the butterflies orient themselves. They kind of change direction so that the sun is coming in at just the right angle. So if the butterfly changes direction, then the angle of the sun on the butterfly is different, and the butterfly will correct itself so it's heading in something like the right direction. But this, and this is the second part of my answer, this requires that the butterfly is kind of programmed in a genetic way. So it's genes. Just a concept that'll be really challenging for some of our listeners. But the butterfly inherits certain characteristics from its ancestors. Just like I have hair, which is kind of like this color, I inherited that from my parents. Butterflies inherit things from their parents too. And one of the things they inherit is a capacity to navigate in a certain direction. And so butterflies that are from Eastern North America tend to navigate in one direction. Butterflies in Western North America, way out in Edmonton, might navigate in a different direction. And so they orient themselves and they point themselves towards Mexico, and then they just start flying in that direction. But it's a complicated story, and there's a lot of moving parts with that explanation. And I've given you just a taste of a frontier of scientific knowledge.
And it's so interesting to know that we don't have all the answers yet. And there are people who have been studying this for a long time. And so science continues on. We're searching and finding little bits at a time.
It's about discovery, finding new things.
Right. And I have a few questions I'd like to ask you that have come in from multiple classrooms. So the first one is from both William Dunbar Public School in Pickering and Y Elementary in Sherwood Park, Alberta. So two very different locations in Canada, wanting to know what is the difference between a moth and a butterfly?
Okay, well, that's a really good question. And I'm glad that people in totally different parts of the country are thinking in very clever ways about understanding the world around us like this, because actually moths and butterflies are different, but they are also related. So they are in the same big group of insects that we call Lepidoptera. Scientists are always coming up with complicated names for simple things. And Lepidoptera is just another word to say moths and butterflies. The difference between moths and butterflies is easy in some cases to understand and a little bit harder in other cases. It's easy in two ways. First, butterflies typically fly around in the daytime. That's one way. A second way is that butterflies typically have a particular kind of shape for their antenna. So butterflies have long, thin antennae with a little club on the end. Moths usually do not have antennae that look like this. And there's even one more difference that's quite common, and that is that moths tend to have thick, fat bodies, and butterflies tend to have long, thin bodies. But when you get down to it, there's a little bit of fuzziness about what you call a butterfly versus what you call a moth. And there are some very big moths out there that look a lot like butterflies, except that they have slightly fatter bodies and slightly weird antennae. But they have big, colorful wings, and if you put them right next to a butterfly, and you put a moth here and a butterfly here, you might have a hard time telling which was the butterfly and which was the moth.
Right.
Sometimes hard.
And the next question I have has also come in from many classes, including Ms. Barrett's class at St. Julia Billiart in Markham. A lot of questions about timing and the life cycle of the monarch butterfly. Can we sort of start at the beginning and go right through? So we talked about the egg, we talked about the caterpillar, the pupa, the adult. What is the timing like on that? Can we sort of go through it one step at a time?
Yeah, and that would be a really, really good thing to do. I'm really glad that I get a chance to do this. And I didn't want to, there's a limit to how much detail I get to put in my presentation because there's a lot to talk about. But this is a really important question. So let's start in Canada. Okay, so what we're going to do is we're going to think about summertime after school is out. So in another week or two, all you kids get to go home and relax and do fun, relaxing, non-school things over the summertime. And what's going to happen is at about that time, monarch butterfly adults are going to start laying eggs. They're going to lay eggs on milkweeds. That's going to happen at the end of June, beginning of July is when that starts. And then what happens is a few days later, a tiny, tiny little caterpillar. It's smaller than a fingernail. Take your baby finger, it's smaller than that. They start off really little. And it's going to start chewing those plants up, and it's going to get fatter and fatter and fatter, and that's going to take maybe 3 weeks or 4 weeks. It's going to become a big, fat caterpillar. And now we're, in August. And what's going to happen is that caterpillar is going to get to the last caterpillar stage, and it's going to form that chrysalis or cocoon. And it's going to change into an adult butterfly, and a couple of weeks after it forms a cocoon, it'll come out as an adult butterfly, depending on the environment it's in. If it's warm, it'll come out faster. If it's cool, it'll come out a bit slower. And then we're halfway through August, maybe beginning of September. These butterflies have now got to get ready to go south, because in September, it's often still kind of nice out, but the night times can get quite cold. And if the butterfly gets caught by frosty weather, then it can be killed. So the butterflies are going to kind of put a hold on their life cycle, and they're going to start flying south around about the beginning of September. And it takes them a little while to get to the southern part of Canada. They just keep on going all the way to Mexico. They go to this single place in Mexico, up in the mountains in this fir forest, a fir tree forest. And the butterflies all stay there, and they get very cold, but most of them don't freeze. And they spend the whole winter, the same butterfly that flew from Canada spends the whole winter chilly, basically, up in the forests in Mexico. And then in the spring, those butterflies fly back out of Mexico and into the United States, and they start the process over again. They lay eggs, they get caterpillars, they get cocoons and adult butterflies. They come further north, they do the same thing again. They come further north and they get to Canada, and then they lay eggs in around about the end of June. And now we've gone through one full year where they start as an egg here, become adult butterflies, go to Mexico, overwinter, come all the way back up here, and start laying eggs in a new year.
Wow. And another question we have had from numerous classrooms, and I should pause just to say, I know we're already a little bit over time, but we have so many great questions. If you do need to leave, if it's lunchtime or you have to move on, please rest assured you can slip out and you won't interrupt. I'm going to try and get a couple more questions in before we close out today. So the first one of those is coming from many classes, including Ms. Oliver's class in Calgary, wondering what is the difference between a male and a female monarch butterfly?
Well, an important difference is that only the females can lay eggs. But if you look at the butterflies, the physical difference between male butterflies and female butterflies is just that male butterflies have a little tiny dot on one of their wings, and female butterflies do not. But you have to look for that. It's just a little dot on one of the black veins of the butterfly wing. And you can tell the difference between males and females by spotting that little black dot. But otherwise, the butterflies look physically the same. Males aren't bigger than females. Females aren't bigger than males. It's just that little dot. But of course, female butterflies do this extremely important thing of being able to lay eggs and create the next generation of butterflies.
And the last question before I turn things back over to Ben comes from Mr. Chechen's class at Cornell Junior Public School in Scarborough, Ontario. And we had this question from other classrooms as well. How or why did they use the name Monarch to name these butterflies?
That's a good question, and I believe the answer to this is that it is just one of the most big and beautiful butterflies, and when it was first found by people who were naming animals in a formal scientific sense, they were really surprised by just how glorious and beautiful this thing was, and how it was kind of everywhere out in the environment. So you're constantly, back before we started causing these butterflies to disappear a little bit, this butterfly was very common. So you'd be surrounded by huge numbers of really big, beautiful butterflies. And it was so beautiful, I guess they decided to call it the monarch. So the kind of like the king or queen of butterflies.
Very interesting. Before we wrap up, Jeremy, I just had one question for you. I noticed that a couple times you mentioned all you need to do to be a scientist is to be curious. Do you have any advice for students that might be considering pursuing a career in biodiversity?
Take that curiosity outside, work with your parents a bit and make sure that, and your teachers, and make sure that you understand something about the place you're going and you don't just kind of take off into the woods all by yourself or something. But take that curiosity outside and pause for a moment. When you go into a little forest, for example, or if you go into a field where there's plants growing around you, don't look at the whole field and just say, it's a field. Look down, look around you, look at the individual plants, look at the insects on the plants, look at the birds that are flying through that environment. Think about what they're doing and think about how many different kinds of things that there are around you. And a lot of the time when you do this, what you'll find is that even in the places that we go every day where we hardly even notice what's around us anymore, you're actually surrounded by a glorious diversity of things, some of which can be incredibly beautiful and an awful lot of which can be incredibly interesting. So what you just have to do is take that curiosity. And if you're curious about biodiversity, then great. It's very easy to take that curiosity and take it outside.
Well, that's all the time we have for today. Thank you, Dr. Kerr, for taking our questions and for telling us all about the monarch butterfly.
It's just absolutely delightful to have a chance to talk to you about something today that I'm so excited about. Thank you for the chance. Thank you.
No problem. This is actually our last PIR live event webinar for the 2017-2018 school year. So on behalf of Partners in Research, I would like to thank everyone for their participation. We look forward to many more great lab events beginning again in September. For more information about these webinars and the other educational programs offered by Partners in Research, please visit pirweb.org. Thank you for tuning in and have a wonderful summer.